I mean, I think in addition to being stubborn, I'm also typically pretty optimistic, realizing that I might not solve the problem 100%, but if it's better than what they had before, or, we can commit to working on it together, I tend to look at it from that perspective. Hey, look what I've done in 4 years. So I've taken these 60 customers, I've figured out who they are, what they need, what's important to them. For me, it's seeing the customers that I've sold a migration deal go live. And that sort of thing keeps me going because I'm like, okay, cool. Like I'm actually what I'm selling is working for these people and they're seeing value and hopefully will be customers of Bullhorn for a very long time.
I think it's terribly important to insist on individual values,
Learning Culture Podcast.
initiative, creation, all these things which we value. It's now possible to make organizations on a larger scale than was ever possible before.
Learning Culture Podcast.
Teach people to analyze the kind of things that are said to them.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Learning Culture Podcast. I am your host, Andrew Barry. This is a show about creating cultures of learning inside companies. And joining me today is a unique guest. This is someone who is typically in the role of the people that we are creating programs for at companies. In other words, the people that are doing the learning. My guest today is Kara Skorepa. She's a national account manager at Bullhorn. Now, the eagle-eyed or eagle-eared among you may be recognizing that name and know that a couple of weeks ago, we released an episode we did with Keith Waitman. Now, Keith, who's the RVP of sales at Bullhorn, is Kara's boss. And it was in that conversation with Keith that I realized that he kept referring to Kara as an example. And I just knew I had to speak to her. And I'm so glad I did, because what you're going to hear in this conversation is that you've got someone here who thinks really critically about her tasks, about her workflows, and about the activities that she performs, and is always looking for ways to improve them. That's the kind of person we love working with at Curious Lion. That's the kind of person we build our programs for. And so it's refreshing to kind of have this conversation. Honestly, I don't get to do this very often. I think you'll enjoy hearing from Kara. She talks about the beginner's mindset, how important that is for her. That's a big thing for us as well. She shares a story about how one of her most negative experiences became one of her most positive. And that was with a client, her first solo call, actually, she did at Bullhorn. She has a stubborn optimism, which she unpacks for us. And I love that sort of dichotomy of those two things, right? The stubborn optimism. And she brings a great perspective on that. She also talks and shares some tips on dealing with pushback or tough internal questions. And finally, she ends with telling me about how she wants to start writing down a lot of these practices that she shares with me in a playbook so she can share it with others. And I just love hearing stuff like that, because, you spend so much time in your career and in your job figuring out things and finding things that work. And when you figured it out and it's leading to success for you, it's such a waste and it's such a shame to not share that with other people. And so we love working with people like Kara, because we get to put them on a stage, and shine a spotlight on them. And we do this in our programs that we create for companies. And so it's just an absolute pleasure to sit down with someone like Kara and to hear that she's thinking of doing that on her own, to share some of that hard-earned wisdom. So I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. And with that, you can sit back, relax, and enjoy my episode with Kara Skorepa. Kara, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really, really excited to dive into this. So a little bit of context first for people listening in. You work on a team at Bullhorn. What's the product? What do you guys sell? What's the industry?
So I am a national account manager here at Bullhorn, and I specifically work on a product that we acquired about 4 years ago. So my role came to be as part of that acquisition. We acquired the product and then really needed a person like myself to come in and manage customers on a day-to-day basis. So that's my primary focus. My role is a bit different from some of the other members of my team, if you will. Those members focus on the core Bullhorn product that we offer the vast majority of our customers within the staffing space. But my product specifically, again, is result of an acquisition and slightly different from our core product.
Mm. And Bullhorn itself is staffing. Yeah, what's exactly the product there?
Yeah, so Bullhorn offers software to staffing firms, basically start to finish, the full recruitment lifecycle.
But that's not the background that you came into Bullhorn with, right? You started your career out in the pharma industry.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I spent the vast majority of my career as a, kind account and client manager within the pharmaceutical
Yeah.
and medical education industry. So, managing day-to-day tasks, very project management focused, that sort of thing. And then
Mm.
came to Bullhorn about 4 years ago.
And did you have any sales experience other than outside of that, like AM work?
No, none.
Yeah.
In fact, I had actually resisted a traditional sales role for a very, very long time. A good friend of mine actually referred me to Bullhorn and said, hey, Kara, you've done some similar tasks, and I think a lot of what you've done in previous roles and responsibilities might translate well over to Bullhorn and the national account manager role.
Hmm. So what was your expectation? I guess what was like your what you thought sales was like, and then what does it feel like now? Like, so what are the differences?
I guess admittedly, I always had this used car salesman, perception of a salesperson. I hate to say it. And I,
Yeah,
I never wanted to be that, right? So I always,
yeah,
resisted, I guess, for that reason. The role I'm in is not that whatsoever. I,
mm,
I didn't really know what to expect, quite honestly, when I came to this company and into this role. Um,
mm,
I think in my sense, ignorance was bliss in a way because it helped me,
yeah,
really jump in and figure out, how to tackle things with a almost, you know, completely blank slate sort of mentality.
yeah, yeah. And I'm going to come back to that because I think that that's a fascinating part of this story for everyone. But let's go through it. So again, I know you set a little bit of context for everyone listening as well. That this show, this season of the show really is about adaptive intelligence and this ability to think on your feet, to think outside the box. And one of the you mentioned now, like the fact that you didn't have these preconceived ideas of what sales was about or anything like that, you were able to bring a beginner's mindset to a lot of what you've done. And so that we'll unpack what that looks like, but I think that's a key component of this as well. And what my goal really is to learn from you and to help make explicit some of the things that you just did really well in this role. And um, I guess last piece of context for everyone, I met Kara through a previous guest on the show, Keith Waitman, who has nothing but good things to say and just absolutely raves about Kara. And so he was like, you should definitely get her on the show because we were talking about growth mindset. I think that was probably the main theme of our conversation. And he was just like, yeah, you should definitely meet Kara. So that's what we're unpacking today. So you joined Bullhorn, you got given this set of clients, and from what I understand, it was from a new acquisition. No one like no one really wanted to dig into it because it was like outside of the normal, type of clients that the more experienced sellers were busy with. It was also had a lot of scrutiny because of this acquisition. Can you talk through like that moment?
Yeah, so I vividly remember sitting at my, first onsite in the hotel lobby with our senior vice president and my manager at the time, and we were talking about decks, and everyone else on the team had gotten their, book of business, if you will, and they said, "All right, Gary, here you go. Here's your book of business." And I just was like, "Cool, okay." Like I admittedly didn't really know what they were talking about. So kind of going back to just not knowing any better. And
Hmm.
I was given a book of about 60 customers, and each of those 60 customers were very different from each other. So my task, I would say those, first 30, 60, 90 days into that first year was just to understand those customers. Each one was like its own unique little child, if you will. And I had to go,
Yeah.
figure out what problem they were facing. And it really ran the gamut, right? It was, some very, very severe problems. Others were more minor support related problems. But I had to take a holistic look at, okay, here's this product that we acquired, figure out what we acquired, and then how to, untangle that ball of yarn, if you will, to get them all to a
Yeah.
good spot.
Yeah. Like what were those initial challenges like when you first started digging into it and you realized first of all everything was different? Like what are some of the like even if they were not common, like what were some of the challenges that were getting thrown up with that your initial experience?
I think a lot of the customers had been oversold. So they were,
Mm,
very upset on the fact that, we were not, we had oversold and underdelivered, I guess. And so it was a lot of conversations of, acknowledging their frustrations, their concerns, and being empathetic to that, and then figuring out how we move forward together. Um, I think also just, when we acquired the product, we acquired the vast majority of the talent. Some of those people exited the business just as you would expect to happen. And so with them obviously went the vast majority of their knowledge. And so it
mm,
was kind of on me to leverage people that were still at the company to figure out, just the kind of basic day-to-day questions. Whereas, on the Bullhorn side, there's a huge network of people that know answers to
yeah.
random questions. That was not the case for my business. And so I
Mm.
was just kind of like, okay, I gotta figure this out some way, somehow. So
And that sort of comes back to that beginner's mindset. You had no choice. You were a beginner, and that played to your advantage in quite a big way. Yeah. So can you think of any like initial discoveries or conversations or anything like that where you had a really great experience with someone where you went in probably not knowing that much about it, but you were curious and ended up learning quite a bit?
yeah, actually, one of my, I would say, most negative experiences ended up turning into one of my more positive customer experiences. My first customer call that I took on my own with no assistance from my team, the customer just kind of laid into us, and rightfully so, right? We had completely oversold, underdelivered up until that point, and I remember him saying, if I had to give Bullhorn a score out of 10 right now, I'd give you a 0. And I was like, okay, like that is not how I was expecting that call to go. But that comment from him really stuck with me. And I was able to make it my goal, if you will, to, anything better than 0 in this, for this customer is going to be an
Mm,
improvement. And so I just
mm,
slowly really tried, there were some tough conversations and some hard times for sure, but slowly tried to just improve and keeping to my word and delivering on what I said I would do. And we were
yeah.
at an on-site, a couple months later, and I followed back up with that person and I said, hey, like, where are we? Are we still at a 0? And we weren't quite at a 10. I won't, give myself that much credit, but we had
Yeah.
significantly improved. I think he said we were at like a 7 or an 8 at that point.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um so I think that was something that was like, oh my gosh, like this is gonna be a challenge, but
Mm,
in a certain sense, I'm almost too stubborn too to just I had to figure it out. Like you said, I
yeah.
had no choice but not to figure it out.
Yeah. Do you still have a good relationship with that customer?
I do. They've since moved out of my deck, but now they're a Bullhorn customer. They're live on our core product. So
Mm,
um it's cool to see them having come full circle and building those relationships, some that started out not so great to turning them into, fans of Bullhorn, if you will.
yeah, absolutely. And if you had to guess at this, what was it about the way you approached it that made them, be open to working with you?
I think it's just being human, honestly. I think, I mean, I'm sure despite me trying to come off as this, like I know everything about Bullhorn, I'm sure they could kind of see right through it. I was 2 months into the job. So I
Mm,
think that, being a bit, naive in a sense and just being human and understanding, hey, I totally get why you're frustrated.
mm,
Can't go back and change the past, but let's move forward and work on this together, sort of thing.
mm, mm. Yeah, I love that. Let's talk about, you mentioned when we spoke before about how you kind of manage yourself to figure it out. So I want to talk through that learning process. Like, what did that look like? How did you go about gathering the information you needed? How did you build the relationships? Like, what did that look like for you?
Yeah. So while I was the only, account manager managing this book of business per se on my team, I had an awesome group of people around me. And so one of the things that our SVP Donnie always says is never win alone, never lose alone. And I think for this business and this acquisition, that was, so true.
Mm,
Senior leadership was very involved and oftentimes talking to these tougher customers with me. And so I was very fortunate to have a lot of different resources around me, and when, one leader's style didn't necessarily match the customer, I could tap into others. And so I think that was, a really big advantage to me personally. And then in turn, I tried to learn from those different leader styles as well.
Mm,
It really hasn't ever been a one size fits all. You have to adapt and know who you're
mm,
talking to and know what their motives are and what they're looking to get out of things.
yeah. So no one size fits all. You have to adapt. That could literally be the slogan for or the tagline for this podcast. Um, that's yeah. So what? How did you like? What talk me through the process of trial and error that I'm sure you must have had to go through here, where you were trying some things, tried lots of different ideas. Some of them got shot down. Like yeah, what did that look like?
Yeah. So I think some of the things, the easiest ones to start with would be, okay, what's worked with other customers maybe on the Bullhorn side? And, we talk all the time about these different playbooks and things like that. And people have asked, like, hey, if you could go back and do it all again, what would your playbook be for this book of business? And while I acknowledge that playbooks are very valuable in certain parts of business, right? Like 101 kind of learning and understanding. I think for this business specifically, it would almost have the opposite effect, right? Because then you become overly
Mm,
reliant on just because this worked before means it's going to work for someone else the next time around. And
yeah,
so I certainly try to keep in mind what's worked before, but allow myself to be open to tweaking that. And so when I would go to
yeah.
leadership and say, hey, here's the problem, I think we could solve it by XYZ because this has worked in the past, but maybe put, an extra twist or sort of flair on it for this
Mm,
specific customer.
yeah. And there were. Did you ever kind of run up against pushback internally on some of those ideas?
Oh, all the time. I think
Yeah.
because it was an acquisition, because it hadn't been done before, it
Mm,
wasn't necessarily pushback, but more seeking to understand. And so when we were able to align it with what the customer was looking to accomplish and still make it a win for Bullhorn, I think we were met with, more agreement as opposed to pushback. But I
mm,
mean, it was new for everyone. So it took some
yeah.
time to kind of understand the unique scenarios that we were coming up against.
Yeah. And let's talk about that for a second, because and then I'll come back to the solution piece. But I kind of skipped over the problem part as well. We talked we do in our work is a lot of time spent on problem definition, and it's sort of like half the battle, if not more, is getting that right. And what you were faced with was a bunch of undefined problems to begin with, right? And so
Yeah.
you had to approach the problem solving of that. It's like what did you see when you got there, and how did you start to make sense of it all?
I mean, I'm a big spreadsheet person. I take lots of notes, make lots of lists. So for me, that was a very easy way to just kind of jot everything down, help it all make sense to me. And then
Mm,
from there, once I was able to kind of bucket out each of those issues, each of those problems, if you will, I was able to uncover some key themes that then I could go to leadership and say, hey, this bucket of customers, if you will, is facing this problem. This
mm,
bucket is facing this problem. And then it made it a little more easy to digest and also tackle for my own sanity because it went from being this very, very tangled mess to a little bit more digestible and understandable.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I can see how that helps. And then, so then you go into senior leadership to kind of to bounce ideas, to get your initial thoughts validated or not. Um, what were you doing with that? So once you'd gone and refined and sort of come up with a solution, like what was your? Because then you've said earlier, like each customer was different. You couldn't just take now this blanket solution and go and So how did you then adapt that for each of the different customers?
That was really just going back to open and honest conversation with the customer and saying, hey, here's how we think we can help you solve this problem, that sort of thing. Does this work for you? And I would say, sometimes right off the bat, they'd say, yeah, that's great. But more often than not, there'd be multiple iterations of those conversations, negotiations, that sort of thing. So it wasn't always, again, it wasn't always a one size fits all.
Mm,
It took some time in building trust and relationships with the customers before we had, I would say, a surefire solution.
mm. What was your cadence like with these customers? Like, how often were you in contact with them? How often were you on calls with them?
Gosh, I mean, my big thing was consistency because that was one theme, if you will, that I had uncovered was lacking pre-acquisition. So,
Mm,
initially I think sometimes I was talking weekly, daily to these people. As we got things in a better spot, it shifted to biweekly or monthly and
mm,
eventually quarterly. So I think one of my customers specifically, I remember their CFO was on every single status call of ours. And it was the type of status call we're talking about support tickets and little nitty-gritty things, but based on the previous relationship and how things had gone, he really felt that he needed to be there. And
mm.
so one of my like, yes type of moments was he finally was like, you know what, Kara, I think things are in a good spot now. I'm going to drop off these calls.
Oh
And
yeah.
so, that was the sort of like small win for me because I was like, okay, this just goes to show how far we've come.
Mm,
Consistency is important. Follow through is important, and just showing that your role as an account manager isn't just there to be there when you want something from them. So
mm. Yeah, I love that. I love that. I'm going to come back to kind of wins and even like losses or frustrations, but just one follow up to one thing you said about spreadsheets and that. Like, how are you? Just almost like a technical question here. Like, how are you keeping track of like what was your CRM process for this?
yeah.
Anything more you can
So
say?
at the time, we were actually using Bullhorn as our CRM internally. Throughout the course of my career and time with Bullhorn, we switched to Salesforce. So
Okay.
two different systems, obviously. But for me, I just obviously would have the company records and things like that in our CRM.
Mm,
But I also kept a very detailed spreadsheet because there were lots of little nuances. Again, that my customers didn't had maybe had different things than our typical Bullhorn customers, versions, for example. My customers
mm,
were all over the board when it came to versions and things like that. So I really had to make sure I was on top of what version they had, and when I was having those conversations, speaking intelligently to the customer about that version. So I had this big old spreadsheet that I tracked everything. And I know it probably was it the most efficient? No, but at the time,
mm.
it just again going back to helping me make sense of and digesting all of the information that we had.
Yeah. What? How do you think? It's something I think about a lot for my business. You've got like your account level information. You've got the opportunity. Um, there's also the individual that you're talking to. Like how are you thinking of that? I'm always curious about how people approach that individual, like keeping up with the stuff that they're interested in, like last things you talked about, stuff that you want to talk about with them next. Like, what does that almost like personal CRM process look like for you?
Yeah, I would just take I have a little notebook and each page of my notebook I have a customer, written at the top, and then I jot down those special little things like,
Mm,
oh, their kid just had a soccer tournament or something
mm.
like that. And when I'm doing
Yeah.
these status calls, I'll just page back to those.
Mm,
Obviously put it in the CRM too, but I feel like some of that more
mm,
personal, soft
mm,
skills sort of stuff I just keep track of,
mm.
and bring up as it makes sense within the
Yeah,
within the conversation.
yeah,
So
yeah. But you've got a handy place to go to like remind yourself of everything that you need for that
yeah,
conversation. Yeah,
if I don't write it down digitally or physically, it's out of my brain.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I love it. And this is what you like you were saying. You managed yourself to be
Mhm.
able to figure this out.
Yeah,
It's making sure you got all these systems in place as well, so that
yeah,
you can operate. What is something? So I want you to think to a time and tell us more about a time where things did not go so well, and you learned a valuable lesson. So I don't know if anything specific comes to mind, but where did that happen? Where there was a mistake or a failure or some kind of thing that just didn't go as planned, but you
yeah.
learned a lot.
Yeah, so a big part of my job obviously is, leading customers through evaluations and migrations. And ideally, they migrate off of the platform we acquired into another Bullhorn solution. So we were in the midst of an evaluation, pretty close to the finish line and had been told, things are going well, things are going well. Um, in reality, they ended up going with one of our biggest competitors.
Mm,
And as like soul crushing as that was at the time, I can now look back and say, okay, I was talking to one person and I was not, one of our big things at Bullhorn is all the 5 points of contact and making sure, you're talking to the CEO, the CFO, that's where like you're not just talking to one person,
mm,
basically. And
mm.
so hindsight being 2020, I realized I was in so deep and so, you know, integrated with that one person, but I had neglected the others on the
Oh
outside.
yeah.
So that was a big, and it was a bigger customer of mine and lost to a big competitor. And so it stung. I mean, it still
Mm,
does. It was almost a year ago, and that
yeah.
sucks. But I think I learned from that. And, going back to our CRM, we have a place within our CRM to track those 5 points of contact. And it's a good gut check to, not only make sure that I'm in communication with those people, but if
Mm,
I can't, then to leverage, our leadership to, hey, can you help me reach out to the CFO? I've got a good
mm,
relationship with the CIO, but notice you have this in common.
mm,
So really leveraging people outside of just me to tap into those additional resources. So we're not
mm,
just going down a rabbit hole with one
mm.
person like
Yeah,
I did before.
I'm like going through all the deals I'm working on now in my head. I'm like, do I have 5 points of contact? Probably not.
It's hard. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
really
yeah,
hard, especially when you want to, I feel like, develop such a meaningful relationship with one person. It's hard to
yeah.
then go do that with multiple other people at the
Yeah,
account and then across multiple accounts
yeah,
too.
yeah.
So,
That's huge. Yeah, I mean, what actually when it's a practical question, like what advice do you have? So I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Sometimes the like you mentioned, like CFO, CIO, and in your world, those may make sense as people that you often talk to in a deal. Were there ever times where it's not necessarily, but you had to like find a way to talk to them just so you could build the relationship, even if they didn't have like a direct interest in the deal you're working on?
yeah, I mean, in my case, a lot of it is like working with the specific subject matter experts, right? So they're in the system day to day. They might not have direct say in the final decision or be the ones to sign, but they
Mm,
they do have the ear of the person that is. So I feel like, and those are more the people I'm talking with for the status calls and things like that. So building that relationship and establishing trust with them, so that then when they're asked by that person, who's ultimately signing the deal, hey, what do you think? They're like,
yeah,
absolutely. There's no question that we should,
yeah.
make this decision.
Yeah. This one thing I always try and think about in those kind of cases, it's because you're talking about almost like your champion, right?
Exactly.
Like there,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
is like how do I turn them into the hero of this story, right? How do I make them look good? What gets them closer to being promoted or whatever? Do you also like think of it like that? Do you ever have that kind of a conversation with any of your champions?
I try to where it makes sense. And I think my big thing is, I try to put myself in their shoes, right? Like if I'm trying to get promoted, I don't want any surprises, right? So I don't want my boss to come to me and like stump me with something that I don't know the answer to. So
Yeah.
that's typically how I try to frame the conversation. Hey, what information is helpful to you? What's
Mm,
a question that you think you'll be asked? Or, framing it that way, so that way there it's not after the fact them coming to me and saying, "Oh shoot, I needed XYZ and I didn't have it." So,
yeah, I love that. I love that. So we're just going back to that one that you are still kicking yourself a year later about. How do you keep yourself going in all of that? You mentioned stubbornness when we first spoke, but like, what does that look? How does that show up for you?
I mean, I think in addition to being stubborn, I'm also typically pretty optimistic. So
Mm,
I think, realizing that I might not solve the problem 100%, but if it's better than what they had before, or we can commit to working on it together. I think, again, going back to my book of business, I focused heavily on migration. So I started with about 60 customers. I'm now down to 30 ish. And all of those, or most of those rather, have migrated over to a solution. Some have left. We have had some churn and, like I said, lost a couple deals. But I tend to look at it from that perspective. Hey, look what I've done in 4 years. So I've taken
mm,
these 60 customers, I've figured out who they are, what they need, what's important to them. We've, kind of established where they're going to go from here, and I've whittled it down. So for me, it's seeing the customers that I've sold a migration deal go live, and that sort of thing keeps me going because I'm like, okay, cool. Like I'm actually what I'm selling is working for these people, and they're seeing value, and hopefully we'll be customers of Bullhorn for a very long time.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so bringing it back full circle to playbooks, right? You mentioned at the beginning that playbooks are, and I like the way you phrase this, they're not enough. It's not that there's anything wrong with them, but they're not enough. And everything we've talked about, your stubbornness, which is like resilience, basically, your ability to solve problems creatively and actually like define the problem before you solve it, beginner's mindset being helpful there, creating systems to be able to manage yourself. All of these are great examples of what I think of as adaptive intelligence, the sort of human intelligence of it um, that makes you successful. But you're also now in a position where you've got a team and you've got people that are following you and working with you. How do you think about leaving, documentation and breadcrumbs and a trail that they can follow to learn from the lessons you learned?
It, it's funny you ask, and that's actually a timely question because I was just talking to my manager about this a couple weeks ago and
Yeah.
kind of what's next for me, at Bullhorn and in my role in my career. And that was one of his big things like, hey, Kara, you've acquired all this knowledge over the past 4 years, some by trial and error, some just by using logic and reason and that sort of thing. Like,
Mm,
start documenting that, start putting it together. And so I've really tasked myself with, just jotting all that down. I have a Google Doc up and just throughout the day, if I'm thinking of something and I'm like, "Ooh, that's a good point," like I just jot it
mm,
down. And at some point, I'm going to go through and format it, make it look nice and pretty. But I think I've just assumed there is no dumb question for this sort of thing, and
mm-hmm.
I didn't know, but I found a way to figure it out. And so, hopefully, through my mistakes, someone else can learn, and it'll be a little bit easier for them, right?
Yeah.
Some of
Yeah.
the nuances of the business I've tried to really document, and I'm sure it will change. Like it
Mm,
always will change, but at least having a baseline for understanding the why something is the way it is, and then
mm,
being able to say, okay, here's how I'm going to approach it, knowing the background of whatever it may
yeah.
be.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I got a little tip for you on that. So if that's like a project you're having to work on now, so you're starting it off in just the right way. I love the fact that you've got this like living document for you to put all your thoughts in. Eventually, you'll organize that and kind of make it, digestible. Here's the part that a lot of people forget is, or just don't do, is that once you've got that, like, great, you can share that with people, they can read it. That's great. But if they don't have an ability to almost like interrogate it, to ask questions of that information, it's very
Yeah.
difficult for them to make it explicit and then to internalize it, for themselves. So one simple thing is to host, kind of, we call it office hours. It's like an office hours format. And so you
Yeah.
share that document with this team beforehand, and then you're just there for an hour a week, whatever it is, answering questions. And you get everyone together, and people join, obviously get the benefit of hearing you answer other questions, but you record those sessions as well and start to like clip parts of it, and you add that to your notes over time. So it's just this like compounding body of knowledge just from the fact that you're getting together to talk about it.
I love that. I
Yeah,
think the voice element too, it's one thing to see it just written down, but to hear people talking through it and
totally.
actually discussing, that's amazing. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's nuance to it, right? And your nuance will come across in a story, which
Mhm.
is not something you would typically put in a document like that. You're not going to write out a couple paragraph story, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's so interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. There's a lot of the adaptive intelligence work. This is another fun fact, right? How many times do you ever feel like sometimes where you're like telling a story and you it's like a long story, and you feel like the other person's like getting bored because it's so long,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah. So and
Yes.
and they also those people who don't mind, and they just like talk, and you just like, now you're the other one stuck on the receiving end, and it's just. But someone, I don't know, I got to find the source for this, but there there was this thing about perception where if you the storyteller feel like that was like a 3 minute story that you just told, even if it was actually 3 minutes, it doesn't feel like that to the person that's receiving it. It's assuming you're a decent storyteller as well and it's an interesting story. But like that was a big shift for me, because if I think about all the times I've been told, listen to a story, it doesn't feel as long as it feels like for the person telling it, and so
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's just an interesting thing in there around like, tell more stories, because it's the
Yeah.
best way to kind of get your point across.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. It's funny you say that. I'm part of this other group, and we've been doing these mastermind exercises. And the first, part of it is one person tells a story for 3 minutes. And what I didn't realize, I had to go last week, and I'm describing my story. And to your point, I feel like I'm talking forever. And the leader of the group was like, okay, keep going. That was only a minute and 20 seconds. And I was like, what? Like I
Yeah.
felt like I had been talking,
Yeah.
talking. And I guess you don't realize, I guess how much detail is actually needed to fill the span of
Yeah.
time. But
Yeah.
I mean, it makes total sense.
Yeah. It's so interesting. It really is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and trying to use that in sales conversations as well. I mean, we all get told this, right? Like, tell more stories, or you go to a storytelling sort of program or class. But yeah, ultimately, like, it comes down to to just you still have to have that experience yourself, and then you
Right.
can get better at learning how to relay it. But just leaning into that sometimes is really all it takes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I love that idea. It's awesome.
yeah. Awesome. Okay, so we talked about the playbook stuff. We talked about treating customers differently. I think that's so key. Kind of like it's the crux point here for why adaptive intelligence is so important, because every conversation is different. I guess a follow-on question from that. You sound like someone who prepares for meetings, like quite
Yeah.
in quite detail. But
Mhm.
um, I'm sure you'll also agree that that meeting, it never goes exactly like you planned, right?
No.
There's always some
No.
kind of like, so what have you learned about that? How have you learned to deal with that fact?
I think when acknowledging it, the meeting isn't going to go completely perfect. And then making sure you don't have to have the answers every single time. No one likes a salesperson that just says yes to everything or is a know it all and gives an answer that's maybe not true. So for me, I'm big with the follow ups and, maybe not leveraging the time in that meeting due to the audience that's present or whatever, but offering the option to schedule a follow up or a deeper dive into the specific topic that maybe I don't know the answer to, or we don't have the resource to
Hmm.
speak to, that sort of thing. And then actually being consistent with follow ups. I try, depending on when the meeting takes place, to either get the follow up in, out to the customer within the hour, 2 hours, or at a minimum by the next morning. Because I think it's so fresh in everyone's mind. If you don't, then it just
Mm,
that all the work you did kind of goes by the wayside.
yep.
So I really try to be very consistent with my follow ups. Almost as much time as I spend preparing, I spend doing the follow ups in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good advice. And that just helps close that gap, I guess, between what you planned the meeting to be and what it ends up being. The more you consistent you are with those follow-ups, the smaller that gap is. Everyone's on
Right.
the same page, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so I think a good last question here is: as you've grown in your role, you've got a team, around you. You've got other people to work with now. And one thing you said when we first met that really stuck with me, and I want to just dig into it a little bit more, is you said that you've gotten really good at leveraging the unique strengths of the people on your team. And this is also a big part of adaptive intelligence and narrative thinking, because it's our ability to spot the exceptional. It's like, and learn from it, right? It's this thing, oh, that person thinks differently to me or can do this thing better than me or whatever. And that's as a leader, a huge talent to have, to be able to spot that and go, oh, I can, and then inspire people to use that for the common cause. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit more about that team and like, how are you leveraging the unique strengths of the people on your team?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I'm super lucky in that sense that I have a lot of different leaders who've, one, been at the company for a really long time. So they've seen lots of different acquisitions and just different customers. And so, one example is, my direct manager, he's like a wizard when it comes to deals and getting creative with things. So when I've got, really complex, negotiation coming up and I know they're going to hound us on price or something like that, I always bounce my ideas off of him because I could sit there and analyze, this spreadsheet for hours and
Mm,
he's able to look at it and say, "Oh, consider this." And it ends up working out really, really well. We present to the customer. I look like the hero, Bullhorn wins, the customer wins, that sort of thing.
yeah, yeah.
So I think just acknowledging like you're not the only person who has to come up with the creative ideas or the solutions. You've got a whole team behind you to help with that and, you know, leverage their strengths or their
Mm,
experiences or their industries, for example.
mm,
Some people on our team maybe have come from a payroll background. So when I'm talking to a customer that's having payroll problems, tapping into those people because I don't know everything about payroll. So I think just being self-aware enough to know that you don't know everything and you can tap into other strengths to ultimately help Bullhorn win overall.
mm, mm. Yeah, I really like that. It's I find like it's all data, right? And if you can ask someone for their perspective, their opinion, that is such a valuable piece of data. Even if that insight isn't the exact thing you need, it might help you think of something else. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's so helpful.
Exactly. You don't necessarily have to take what they say for the gospel truth, but if you take a little
Yeah,
nugget of it and then apply it, it's just different perspective and different
yeah,
insights that, you might not have already thought of.
yeah. Goes back to that beginner's mindset again, like never thinking that you know everything, like that someone else can always teach you something.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
still learning. There's still things I find out about, my role and my job that I'm like, huh, interesting.
yeah,
I did not
yeah,
know that. I'm 4 years into this and I'm still
yeah.
still learning something new. So
Yeah. Well, I think that's made you as successful as you are, and I think it will continue to as well. That to me is what defines a good leader, is to keep thinking that, to keep yeah, just never believe that you know everything.
yeah.
Yeah. So let's end off on that note. Then you're 4 years into this role now. You came in from a totally different background. You've made some mistakes. You've learned some lessons. You've had some wins. What advice do you have now for Kara 4 years ago? What would you tell her when she started this job?
I would say don't get discouraged and give yourself more credit because sometimes you don't realize what you're doing is actually solving a big problem or that you are capable of solving that problem. Um, when you look back, it's been kind of cool. I've been working on this document and I'm like, wow, I've actually done a lot of cool things and accomplished a lot of cool things. So um, don't get discouraged and give yourself more credit than you think you
Hmm.
deserve.
That is excellent advice for everybody listening. And yeah, be kind to yourself, give yourself credits, and keep moving forward. That's the thing. Keep learning, keep asking questions. You're certainly a role model in that respect, Kara. So yeah,
Thank you.
thank you for coming on the show, for sharing this with us. I know you're a busy sales professional, so you've got a lot of stuff on your plate right now. And yeah, I appreciate you coming on and sharing that experience with us.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation. I had fun.
Yeah, it's a good time. And yeah, everyone who's listening, stay tuned for more episodes. We will have a lot more from people like Kara, maybe people on her team even, as we expand and learn more about what people out there are doing a great job on. Hello, hello. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It's Andrew again with a quick message. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to leave us ratings and reviews where you listened. If you're on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe buttons and feel free to leave a comment. We love hearing from our listeners and viewers. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please take the time to give us a rating and leave a review. Once again, we love hearing from our loyal listeners. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please hit the follow button to make sure that you don't miss new episodes as they come out. See you next week for another episode of the Learning Culture Podcast. Thank you for listening.